I think it would be fair to divide the web into two eras, kind of BG and AG, before Google and after Google. Things were different before the Google search engine was created and before what my colleague Siva Vaidyanathan calls the Googleization of everything. The early web, before Google came around, was largely designed to be a big distributed hyperlinked document. The expectation was that you would find the things you were interested in or that you might want to be interested in by surfing this web, by hopping from document to document to document. As a result, there were a number of efforts at indexes or tables, kind of, a yellow pages that would list interesting or useful resources. You might have, say, a list of universities on the web, back when this was a page worth of a list. I don't think anyone expected the web to reach the scale that it would very quickly reach. It was natural that once it started to reach that scale, that people would start to automatically index the contents of the web. While the idea of a search engine, so-called, was unusual, we'd been indexing content for a couple of millennia. Libraries and information scientists were already applying these ideas of finding keywords and authors and titles and making indexes of these in the printed world, with books and documents of various sorts. And so they now could use that knowledge that had been accumulated over a long period of time on the World Wide Web. Basically, it's the same problem, but now on the internet. So how do you do this? I always like to take kind of a homunculus approach to programming. I imagine this little person that we can charge with a given task and give them very explicit instructions as to how to complete that particular task. So if we were going to hire some person to be a search engine, what exactly would we expect them to do? First thing, they would have to have a starting list, a list of websites to visit. And you can't just do one website and hope that it gets places. If you go to Pepsi.com, that's going to be a dead end, right? You're not going to actually get beyond that. So ideally, you want a set of pages that link to a lot of other pages. So we start with that list, and then we just start going down that list one by one by one. And so you would go to a browser, your little guy would go to a browser and call up the first page on the list and start to look and see what was on there that they needed to record. So they might record, especially early on, things like the title. If it was obvious if there was an author, they could record that. But pretty quickly, it became clear that they really wanted to extract some of the text on the page and try to figure out whether that could indicate what this was about. Early text analysis of this material. And at a very basic level, one of the ways you can do that is look for words that appear on this particular web page that are relatively rare on the web as a whole. So if this page mentions the word dirigible 3 times, it's a pretty rare thing to find on your average web page, there's a good chance you'd want to send those looking for airships or dirigibles to this particular page. So you need to look at that content and then use it to provide some kind of a keyword index that will then tie back to this page. And once you've done that for one page, you then move on to the next. Not just the text, though. You also want to pay special attention to where the page links. Pull out those hyperlinks. Because if those hyperlinks point to a page that isn't already on your list, you've now discovered something else to crawl. So that list that you start with might not be super long, but little by little, you're going to add all of the ones you haven't visited yet to that list. I mean, the ideal is eventually you'd hit the end of the web. You would have indexed every page on the web, but no search engine has actually done that. It's just kind of an ideal. And especially as the web grew, that was just inconceivable, right? So then you set this dude up who has this index at a table, and people can come up and say, I want to find a dirigible, and he'd look at his index and say, there's the dirigible. Now, if you've done a little programming, especially programming where you pull down and analyze text from the web, constructing a simple search engine like I've just described may seem pretty easy at this stage. And honestly, it is. You could, in a day, sit down and design a very simple search engine, I think. But the devil is in the details. First of all, it's a matter of scale. You need to kind of be able to go very fast and collect a very large amount of data. You also need to find good ways of doing that kind of indexing and discovering what the topic of a page is. And eventually you add lots and lots of what are called signals to decide what kind of a page is good. In the early days of the web, people were trying to attract others to your page and therefore were also willing to try to trick you into this. And when I say people, generally I mean people selling porn, because porn was one of the few things that would sell on the early internet. It was something that was actually making money. So you may think you were looking for dirigibles, but if you could attract those people to your porn site, 1 out of 100 of those would say, oh, well, I thought I was looking for dirigibles, but now I know what I'm really looking for. And then 1 out of 100 of those might actually be willing to supply a credit card number, right? So these early search engines were not just at war with each other, they were also at war with these spamdexers. And the spamdexers, frankly, were winning. AltaVista and some of the very successful early search engines were becoming useless because, you had to kind of comb through the results to find what you were still looking for. Into this mess came Google, and Google added something else. When they analyzed a page, they also assigned that page a certain reputation, what they called PageRank. And the way they measured this was to see how many people had linked to a page. So if you wanted to trick people into coming to your page, you suddenly couldn't just manipulate the text on your own page, but you had to create a bunch of links from other pages linking to yours. And moreover, if those pages didn't have any incoming links, if they didn't have, this page rank, sometimes called Google juice, they couldn't lend credibility to your fraudulent page. So it became much more complicated to trick these search engines, and particularly Google, in this case, into indexing you if you were not really what you said you were. It doesn't mean they didn't try. It doesn't mean they don't still try. If you have a website on the web right now, at some point someone's going to approach you and ask you if you want to buy links. This idea of link farming, of creating links that would make your page look more successful than it is a big part of how people advertise their services on the web right now. And if you have a page that is really useful and lots of people are visiting, someone will approach you and ask if they can buy a link from you. This idea of Google Juice, or as a kind of theoretical idea, is now monetized in some sense. So when we talk about Google, it feels like it's kind of the end of history, right? Google is the 800-pound gorilla by far in terms of what we think about in search. There have been, especially in the last 10 years, some competitors from Bing and Baidu, but overall it seems like Google is unlikely to be dethroned. And simply, instead, rather than seeing Google end as a search engine, I suspect we'll see the end of search engines as we know them, right? I suspect they'll be replaced by a number of possible things. They might be replaced by something like Facebook and Twitter, and we've already seen this a bit. That kind of community filtering, pointing you towards things you didn't know you needed to find. And eventually we might find that Google kind of knows you well enough that it can guess what you want or knows what you want even before you do. So you don't need to come up with a query. It might say, I see that you are interested in these things. I bet you'd also be interested in dirigibles. That has been the stated aim of Google for a very long time, to know more about what you're looking for than you do. Now, that said, as of right now, there's no question that Google continues to be the dominant force in search engines. When you have a question, there's a good chance you're going to Google it, and a very, very small chance that you're going to Baidu it or Bing it, right? So Google remains in that position, but I think as we see the future of search disappear from search engines and move into other spaces, Google is going to struggle to redefine what it means to search online.